The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. You've seen it. The person who talks the most, who fills every silence, who needs to be heard above everyone else. They think they're commanding attention, but they're actually begging for it. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't compete for airtime. It sits in the corner, quiet and observing, and somehow every eye in the room finds it eventually. Machiavelli knew this. He understood that control isn't taken through force of voice. It's claimed through force of presence. But in a world where everyone is screaming to be noticed, where silence is mistaken for weakness, what happens to those who understand its true weight? We live in the age of noise. Constant noise. Notifications, opinions, voices layered on voices until nobody can hear themselves think. We've been trained to believe that influence requires volume. That if you're not speaking, you're not contributing. That silence equals absence. So we talk. We fill gaps. We add our voice to every conversation, whether we have something valuable to say or not. And in that desperate performance, we miss something crucial. We miss the fact that attention is finite. That the more you speak, the less people actually hear you. That true influence isn't measured by how much space you take up, but by how much space people give you willingly. That's where our journey begins. In the gap between noise and power. Between the person who needs to speak and the person who chooses to. Machiavelli spent his life studying rulers, watching them rise and fall, analyzing what separated the remembered from the forgotten. And one pattern emerged again and again. The leaders who lasted weren't the ones with the best speeches. They were the ones who knew when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. They understood something fundamental about human nature. That people project onto silence. That restraint creates curiosity. That the less you reveal, the more people lean in. Machiavelli wrote about this indirectly, between the lines of The Prince. He didn't say, "Be silent," explicitly. He said, "Appear one way while being another." He said, "Let others speak while you observe." He said, "The wise prince conserves his words as carefully as his gold." Because words, once spoken, can't be taken back. They reveal your position. They expose your thinking. They give your opponents ammunition. But silence? Silence reveals nothing. It gives nothing away. And in that void, you maintain complete control. Let's examine why this is so difficult for most of us. Why silence feels like drowning. Why we rush to fill empty space with words we don't mean and opinions we haven't fully formed. The answer, as always, sits in the shadow. That part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. The part that's terrified of being invisible, of being forgotten, of existing in a room full of people and not mattering. Every time you interrupt, every time you speak over someone, every time you fill a comfortable silence with uncomfortable words, it's not confidence. It's fear. Fear that if you're not heard, you're not real. Jung called this the persona's desperate need for validation. We build these elaborate masks, these performance identities, and then we need constant feedback to know the mask is working. Silence threatens that, because in silence, there's no feedback, no applause, no confirmation that you exist in the way you want to be seen. So we talk, we explain, we narrate, we become our own color commentary, terrified that without our voice, we'll disappear. But here's the trap. The more you speak to prove you're there, the less present you actually become. You turn into background noise. Wallpaper. The person everyone expects to talk but nobody actually listens to. I watched a meeting once where 12 people sat around a table. 11 of them spoke. Some spoke multiple times, competing for dominance, interrupting each other, building on each other's ideas without listening to them first. And one person said nothing. Just watched, listened, made notes, and by the end of the meeting, When a decision needed to be made, everyone turned to that silent person. Not because they demanded attention, but because their restraint had created weight. Their silence had built anticipation. And when they finally spoke, 3 sentences, everyone listened. That's not an accident. That's strategy. The emotional cost of constant talking is invisibility through overexposure. You become predictable, easy to dismiss. The person who always has something to say becomes the person whose words carry no weight. Because if everything is important enough to vocalize, then nothing is actually important. You dilute your own influence. You spend your currency on transactions that don't matter. And slowly, without realizing it, you train people not to listen to you. Not out of malice, just out of efficiency. They know your words won't carry consequence, so they stop tracking them. There's a mechanism underneath all of this. Society rewards performers and mistakes performance for substance. We've built entire industries around the ability to speak confidently about nothing. To fill time, to sound informed, to project authority through volume. But projection isn't possession, and the people who truly hold power in any room are not the ones performing. They're the ones observing. They're watching who talks the most and reveals the least. Who listens and who just waits for their turn to speak. Who can sit in silence without discomfort. And they're using that information to map the room, to understand dynamics, to know exactly when their words will land with maximum impact. Power in a room doesn't come from speaking. It comes from knowing when your silence is more valuable than your voice. And that knowledge, that discernment, only comes through practice. Through the discipline of restraint. Through learning to sit with the discomfort of not being heard and realizing that discomfort is just your ego, not your essence. Your essence doesn't need to announce itself. It just is. Machiavelli's strategy of silence was never about being quiet for the sake of it. It was about information asymmetry, about knowing more than you reveal, about letting others expose their positions while you keep yours concealed. In The Prince, he advised leaders to observe everything, but let others speak first. Because the first person to speak shows their hand. They reveal what they want, what they fear, what they're willing to compromise on. And the person who speaks last? They get to respond with full information. They get to calibrate their words with precision. They get to appear measured, thoughtful, strategic. Not because they are more intelligent, but because they were more patient. This is the law. Silence is strategic patience. It's the discipline of letting a room unfold before you shape it. Think about negotiations. The amateur speaks first, lays out their position, explains their reasoning. And in doing so, they give away every advantage. The professional sits back, asks questions, listens, waits, and only when they understand the full landscape do they speak. And when they do, their words carry weight because they've been informed by everything that came before. They're not guessing, they're responding. And response, when timed correctly, is always more powerful than initiation. Machiavelli saw this play out in Renaissance politics constantly. The advisor who spoke the most in council was rarely the one whose advice was taken. But the advisor who listened to everyone, who asked clarifying questions, who waited until the prince specifically turned to them. That advisor shaped policy, not through volume, through timing, through understanding that influence isn't about how often you're heard. It's about how much weight your words carry when you finally choose to speak. History is full of leaders who mastered this. Abraham Lincoln was famous for his silence in cabinet meetings. He would let his advisors argue, debate, sometimes even fight verbally. And he would sit there, listening, taking it all in. Hours would pass, and then, when everyone had exhausted themselves, he would speak. A few sentences, a decision, and because he had absorbed every perspective, His decision was difficult to argue with. Not because he was smarter than his advisors, but because he had more information than any single one of them. His silence had been an intelligence-gathering operation. Or consider Angela Merkel. Love her or hate her politically, her strategy in rooms was masterful. She rarely spoke early in meetings. She listened. She watched body language. She noticed who aligned with whom, who deferred to whom, and then she would speak, and her words would land in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. People called her quiet. They underestimated her, and that underestimation was her greatest asset. Because while they were performing, she was learning. While they were talking, she was thinking. And when the moment came to act, she acted from a position of complete information. But let's address the moral complexity here. Isn't this manipulative? Isn't strategic silence just a more sophisticated form of deception? Maybe. Or maybe it's just intelligence. There's a difference between withholding information to harm someone and withholding your position until you understand the context. There's a difference between manipulative silence, the kind that punishes, and strategic silence, the kind that informs. The first is a weapon. The second is a tool. And the distinction comes down to intent. Are you silent because you're gathering information to make a better decision? Or are you silent because you want to control someone? One serves clarity, the other serves ego. Machiavelli's law wasn't about cruelty. It was about not volunteering disadvantage. It was about recognizing that in any room, any negotiation, any relationship dynamic, information is power. And the person who shares everything first is the person who loses leverage. This doesn't mean you should never be vulnerable. It doesn't mean you should never share. It means you should be intentional about when and with whom. It means recognizing that silence is a choice, not a failure. And when wielded consciously, it becomes one of the most powerful tools you possess. So where does this leave you? Right now, in your actual life, in the meetings you attend, the conversations you have, the relationships you navigate. If you're honest, you're probably one of two types. Either you talk too much, filling silence because it makes you uncomfortable, or you stay silent but not strategically. You stay silent out of fear, out of not knowing what to say, out of anxiety that your words won't matter. Neither of these is the silence Machiavelli is pointing toward. His silence is conscious, chosen, strategic. It's the silence of someone who could speak but chooses not to. And that choice makes all the difference. Let's go deeper into the shadow work here. What is it about silence that terrifies you? For most people, it's one of two things. Either they're afraid of being forgotten, or they're afraid of being seen. If you talk constantly, you're probably afraid of being forgotten. You need to remind people you exist. You need to prove your value through contribution, even when contribution isn't needed. But if you're silent out of fear, you're probably afraid of being truly seen. Because once you speak, once you reveal your thinking, people can judge it. They can disagree. They can dismiss you. So you stay small. You stay quiet, not out of strength, but out of self-protection. Jung would tell you that both of these patterns are the shadow running your life. The first is the shadow of worthlessness, trying to earn value through performance. The second is the shadow of inadequacy, protecting itself through invisibility. But neither of these is power. Neither is presence. Real presence, the kind that commands a room without speaking, comes from integration. From recognizing that your value isn't determined by how much you contribute to a conversation. Your value is inherent, and from that foundation, you can choose when to speak and when not to. Not out of fear, out of discernment. Here's what happens when you integrate this. When you move from reactive silence or compulsive talking into conscious restraint, you start to notice things you never noticed before. the dynamics in a room. Who defers to whom? Who's performing and who's thinking? Who's actually listening and who's just waiting for their turn? You become a reader of energy, of power, of subtle cues that most people miss because they're too busy talking. And that information becomes your advantage, not to manipulate, but to navigate, to understand, to know when your words will actually land and when they'll just be noise. Nietzsche called this self-overcoming, the ability to transcend your conditioning, to break free from the herd behavior of filling silence because everyone else does. To stand apart not through loudness but through presence. He understood that true power is internal, that it comes from mastery over your impulses, your fears, your need for validation. And silence is one of the purest tests of that mastery. Can you sit in a room full of talking people and not need to add your voice? Can you let others shine while you observe? Can you trust that your moment will come and that when it does, your words will matter more because they've been saved? Every time you speak without thinking, you lose energy. You leak power. You give away information that could have been leverage. You dilute your impact. But every time you choose silence, even when you have something to say, you build something. You build weight. You build anticipation. You build the sense that when you do speak, it's worth listening to. And that sense, that reputation, that presence, that's what actually controls a room. Not the volume of your voice, the gravity of your silence. The transformation from talker to strategist isn't instant. It's a practice, a daily, moment-by-moment choice to pause before you speak. To ask yourself, does this need to be said? Does it need to be said by me? Does it need to be said right now? And most of the time, the answer to at least one of those questions is no. Most of what we say is filler. It's social lubrication. It's proof of existence. But it's not strategic. It's not intentional. And it's costing us more than we realize. Think about the last meeting you were in. How much was actually said versus how much needed to be said? How many people spoke just to be heard versus because they had something valuable to contribute? How much time was wasted on repetition, on clarification, on people talking past each other because nobody was actually listening? Now imagine if half those people had stayed silent, if they had listened instead of performed, if they had waited until their insight actually added value instead of just adding volume. The meeting would have been half as long and twice as effective. That's not theory, that's mathematics. But here's where it gets interesting. The person who practices strategic silence doesn't just benefit in meetings. They benefit in every interaction. Because silence creates space, and in that space, people reveal themselves. They fill the void. They share more than they intended. They expose their thinking, their fears, their desires. And you're just sitting there, listening, absorbing, understanding. You're not manipulating them into revelation. You're just not interrupting it. You're letting human nature do what it does, which is to fill silence with truth. I know someone who built an entire career on this. Not in politics, in sales, and they were the top performer in their company for 7 years straight. Their secret? They barely talked. In a field that rewards talkers, that celebrates the gift of gab, they mastered the opposite. They asked one question, then shut up. And in the silence that followed, clients told them everything. Their budget, their fears, their real needs, their objections, everything. And all my friend had to do was listen, wait, and then respond with precision. They didn't win through persuasion. They won through information. Information that clients gave freely because someone finally gave them space to think out loud. This is Machiavelli's strategy in action. Not in a royal court, in a conference room, in a coffee shop, in a negotiation over contract terms. The setting changes, but the principle remains. Whoever speaks less and listens more controls the outcome. Not through force, through understanding. And understanding, when combined with patience, is unbeatable. Nietzsche wrote, "The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die." As well, the minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind. Changing your opinion about silence is exactly this kind of skin shedding. For years, maybe your whole life, you've believed that speaking equals contributing. That silence equals absence. That if you're not heard, you don't matter. But what if all of that is backwards? What if the people who matter most are often the ones who speak least? What if your silence is actually your greatest contribution because it creates space for clarity instead of adding to confusion? The rebirth happens when you stop seeing silence as something to endure and start seeing it as something to wield. When you stop rushing to fill gaps and start appreciating them. When you realize that a room full of people talking is just noise, but a room where one person speaks with intention is transformation. You become that person not by talking more, but by talking less. Not by having all the answers, but by asking better questions. Not by proving yourself constantly, but by being so solid in who you are that proof becomes unnecessary. You stop speaking to be noticed. You speak to create impact. And impact, real impact, requires silence before and after. Silence before, to understand what's needed. Silence after, to let your words land. The people who rush from sentence to sentence, who layer point on point without pause, they're not creating impact. They're creating noise. And noise, no matter how intelligent it sounds, is still just noise. It fades. It's forgotten. It's replaced by the next loud thing. But words that emerge from silence, words that are chosen carefully and delivered with precision, those words echo. Those words shape. Those words control. Let's make this practical. Let's bring it into your life right now. Today, this week, the next meeting you're in, try this. Set a rule for yourself. You don't speak until at least 3 other people have spoken. Not because you don't have something to say, but because you're practicing strategic patience. You're gathering information. You're watching dynamics. You're seeing who dominates, who defers, who's actually thinking versus who's performing. And when you finally speak, when you've absorbed the landscape, notice how your words land differently. Notice how people listen a little harder. How your point carries a little more weight. That's not magic. That's strategy. In conversations, practice the pause. Someone says something and your instinct is to respond immediately. Resist. Wait 3 seconds. It feels like an eternity at first. But in those 3 seconds, 2 things happen. First, you give yourself space to actually think about what you want to say. To choose your words instead of just reacting. Second, you create anticipation. The other person leans in slightly. They wonder what you're thinking. And when you do speak, they're actually listening. Not just waiting for their turn. Actually listening. That's the power of the pause. It transforms dialogue from a tennis match into a conversation. Here's another practice. In any group setting, commit to asking 3 questions before you make one statement. This does 2 things. It shows you're actually engaged, actually curious, actually listening. And it gives you information. The more questions you ask, the more you understand the room, the dynamics, the hidden agendas, the unspoken tensions. And when you finally do make a statement, it's informed by all of that. It's not just your opinion thrown into the void. It's a strategic move based on full information. That's how you control a room without dominating it. That's how you lead without announcing you're leading. The core law, distilled. Silence is not the absence of power. It's the conservation of it. Every word you don't say is energy you keep. Every pause you create is space for clarity. Every moment you listen instead of talk is information you gain. And in any room, Any relationship, any negotiation, information plus timing equals control. You don't need to be the loudest. You just need to be the most aware. And awareness comes from silence, not from speaking. Machiavelli's strategy of silence isn't about being cold or distant. It's about being intentional. It's about recognizing that your words are valuable, and valuable things shouldn't be given away freely. It's about understanding that presence is more powerful than performance. That people remember how you made them feel, not what you said. And the person who listens deeply, who creates space for others, who speaks only when they have something worth saying, that person makes people feel seen, heard, valued, and those feelings create loyalty. They create trust. They create the kind of influence that no amount of talking can manufacture. Think about the people in your life who have the most influence over you. The ones whose words actually change your thinking. I'd bet most of them don't talk constantly. They're not the loudest people you know. They're the ones who, when they speak, you stop what you're doing and listen. Because their words are rare enough to be valuable. Because their silence has created weight. Because they've earned the right to be heard through the discipline of not always speaking. That's what you're cultivating. That's the presence you're building. The world will keep rewarding volume. At least on the surface. The person who talks the most will often get the credit, the recognition, the applause. Let them have it, because underneath, where real power lives, where actual decisions get made, where influence really operates, it's the silent ones who control everything. They're the ones the talkers look to when they need a real answer. They're the ones who shape outcomes through suggestion rather than demand. They're the ones who leave a room and everyone remembers they were there, even though they barely spoke. You don't control a room by dominating it. You control it by understanding it better than anyone else in it. And understanding requires silence. It requires listening. It requires the patience to let others reveal themselves while you remain concealed. That's not manipulation. That's wisdom. That's the same wisdom Machiavelli tried to teach 5 centuries ago. The wisdom that gets lost in a culture that mistakes volume for value and silence for weakness. But you know better now. You know that silence, strategic silence, is one of the most powerful tools you possess. So here's the invitation. If this resonates, if you feel that pull toward a more intentional way of being in rooms, in conversations, in the world, then stay. Subscribe, because we're going deeper. We're exploring more of these timeless principles from Machiavelli, from Jung, from Nietzsche. We're learning how to move through the world with more presence and less performance. How to influence without announcing it. How to lead without demanding to be followed. And maybe, together, we'll discover that the most powerful thing you can do in any room is often nothing at all. The next time you walk into a meeting, a conversation, a room full of people, remember this. You don't have to announce yourself. You don't have to prove you're the smartest person there. You don't have to fill every silence. You just have to be present. Fully present. Watching, listening, understanding. And when the moment comes, when your words will actually matter, you'll know. And everyone else will too. Because your silence will have given your words weight. Your restraint will have built your authority. And your presence, your conscious, strategic presence, will control the room without you ever having to raise your voice. Machiavelli understood this. Power doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Power sits quietly, watches carefully, and speaks precisely. And now, so will you.